Last week we saw British strategy focus on the North African campaign, and watched Churchill put a ton of pressure on Auchinleck to start Crusader early. Auchinleck may have insisted on November of 1941 as the earliest his battle could start, but was the British army ready in time? Did they have enough tanks? Did they have enough men? Did they have the right commanders? It's time to look at British forces prior to Crusader. Notes and sources will be in the pinned comment. Timestamps to various parts of the video are in the description. During Wavell's era, British forces in North Africa were known as the Western Desert Force, but Auchinleck now renamed it 13th Corps, giving it a formal army name. After Battle Axe, the British also reinforced the Middle East with additional tanks and forces, meaning that Auchinleck could set up a second corps in Egypt as well. This second corps was called 30 Corps, the same one that would later take part in Operation Market Garden. Because there was now 2 corps in North Africa, this therefore required the establishment of an army command. Thus, the famous British 8th Army was born. Auchinleck chose Lieutenant General Sir Alan Cunningham to take command of 8th Army. Cunningham had served in the Royal Artillery in World War I, winning both the Military Cross and the Distinguished Service Order. By 1940 he was promoted to Lieutenant General and was in command of British East African forces in Kenya. Wavell ordered Cunningham to advance into Italian Somaliland to engage the Italians there. Cunningham did this and then invaded Abyssinia, smashing Italian forces under the Duke of Aosta. By late summer 1941, Cunningham was victorious, losing just 500 British for the capture of 50,000 Italians. His success was taken as complementary to O'Connor's victories in Libya, but whereas O'Connor had had only a few brief mentions by press and Prime Minister, Cunningham now became well known. According to his contemporaries, Cunningham was charming and a talker, but irritable, and he was also out of his depth. In East Africa, he had to improvise everything, and his command had been no larger than 4 brigades of infantry. Now in North Africa, he was in command of an army consisting of 2 army corps with 3 additional army brigades, 2 additional divisions of infantry, and a bunch of staff, and lots of different organisations. He was rather like the successful owner of a village shop suddenly put in charge of a London department store. We also have to bear in mind that the terrain was different in North Africa than it was in East Africa, and this impacted Cunningham's performance. The terrain was so different from that of East Africa, where we had to make use of tracks through bush country. The desert was all the same, and just nothing, with navigation as if you were at sea. Just like all the British officers at his rank, he knew little about tanks. He was an artillery guy, who had infantry experience in East Africa, where there were very few tanks. And the tank combat that went on in East Africa was nothing like on the scale of that of North Africa. Plus, unlike O'Connor, who had 6 months to get used to tanks at a time of relative quiet, Cunningham had 2 months to prepare, and this was during a time of frantic expansion. I arrived in August and was told that there would be an offensive in November. I therefore had 2 months only in which to form and train an army. Some of the divisions were not there. Apart from 4th Indian Division and 7th Armoured Division, most of the troops were quite untrained. Time was so short, that was my trouble. And unlike O'Connor fighting against the inexperienced Italians, Cunningham was going up against 2 German panzer divisions consisting of veterans of mobile armoured and combined arms warfare. This was bad enough, but worse, Cunningham also had little knowledge about other modern technologies, including the radio. Sureness of command depends on professional knowledge and experience. However great the qualities of leadership in a man, he cannot make use of them unless he is a master of the technical details of his profession, unless he knows his subordinates' jobs at least as well as they. Otherwise, his orders, made in partial ignorance, must be given and received with underlying diffidence. Cunningham was now in command of a bunch of professional commanders and formations that had experience fighting in North Africa, and they watched him as he tried to learn from them whilst also trying to command them. It was an embarrassing position. I felt he was not happy in Egypt. He did not dominate conferences as he had in East Africa. His success in East Africa was the reason why Auchinleck chose Cunningham to lead the 8th Army. After the disaster that was Battle Axe, the old generals Cray, Morshead, Beresford Pierce and so on were gone by October, and a new wave of officers took their stand. Their credentials, however, were not great. Lieutenant General Alfred Godwin-Austen was the guy now put in charge of 13th Corps. Godwin-Austen was an infantryman at heart who had served in World War I. He'd fought in Somaliland in late 1940, where he'd had to evacuate his small and outnumbered force after the Battle of Tobruk Garrison. Churchill had not been impressed by this, and wanted Godwin-Austen put before a court to justify his actions. Wavell defended Godwin-Austen's decision to withdraw, and this court thing didn't happen. But Churchill never forgave Godwin-Austen, and his action in Somaliland would come back to haunt Godwin-Austen later. After Somaliland, Godwin-Austen commanded 12th African Division in East Africa, which was part of Cunningham's force that helped defeat the Italians in Abyssinia. So Godwin-Austen and Cunningham had worked together at least, but again neither had experience with tanks. The other corps in 8th Army was 30 Corps, commanded by General Vyvyan Pope, an experienced commander of armoured warfare. He was known at the time as being one of the most able officers in the Royal Tank Corps, and was seen as a bright and intelligent person, having served in several armoured units. The perfect guy to lead a tank corps. Except Pope was killed in an air crash in early October, so probably the most qualified person the British had to lead the armoured force was now dead, and his replacement was General Norrie. Lieutenant General Charles Willoughby Norrie was an experienced cavalry officer. Horses, however, were not tanks, and Norrie was now in command of 30 Corps, where the bulk of British armour would be. Norrie had commanded 1st Armoured Brigade and 2nd Armoured Division, but had not seen action with these units. He certainly had no experience fighting in the desert with either of them. He was also known as being too nice to his subordinates, and a true gentleman, which isn't really the guy you want in charge of your tanks. And, by the way, this is the same Norrie that would later become the Governor of South Australia in 1944 and the Governor-General of New Zealand in 1952. So, not a lot of good generals here, but Cunningham did have an experienced General Staff Officer in Brigadier General Galloway. However, he wasn't easy to get on with. Galloway himself was a forceful personality, crisp in speech, impatient and, like his army commander, inclined to short temper. Though he supplied some of the knowledge of desert warfare that Cunningham lacked, he was hardly the man to make Cunningham feel any more easy and comfortable in his headquarters. This lack of experienced generals was both a blessing and a curse, because on the one hand there was little relevant experience at the top of the British leadership, but it also meant that Cunningham didn't have to assert himself over a large number of veteran tank generals. Overall, though, it would be fair to say that Auchinleck and his commanders were out of their depth when it came to armoured warfare, which is why they turned to the one guy that knew everything about it, Percy Hobart. Because Auchinleck and Cunningham had no experience with armoured warfare, and none of their immediate subordinates had a clue either, Cunningham had a choice. He could take the existing British 1916 to 1918 idea of how to create tank forces which had existed up until 1940, or listen to General Percy Hobart. He decided to listen to Sir Percy Cleghorn Stanley Hobart. This is the same Hobart who would come up with the Hobart's Funnies tanks later in the war, the Crocodile and the now famous DD tank, just to name a few. Hobart had been an advocate of armoured warfare since the early 1920s and had gained the reputation of being the most senior expert in tank warfare. He was also known as a brilliant trainer of troops. It was he who had formed 7th Armoured Division and later went on to form the 79th Armoured Division as well, the formation the funnies would come from. However, while he certainly had his qualities, he wasn't easy to work with, and he made a lot of enemies by being impatient and to the point. He also had some crazy views about armoured warfare, thinking tanks alone could win battles without the help of the other arms, which, to be fair, a lot of armchair generals still think is the case. As we will see shortly, this wasn't a good view, and Hobart would have a massive impact on the outcome of Crusader. Cunningham went with Hobart's views on how to create a tank force, although not completely. Cunningham decided to use a more combined arms approach. However, he still decided to keep the armour and the infantry separate, thanks to Hobart's views. Therefore, the tanks would mostly go into 30 Corps, and the infantry would mostly go into 13th Corps. So, just to emphasise this and clarify, while this is technically a combined arms approach, the tanks were still separate from the infantry, which was the Hobart way of thinking. This splitting of the tanks from the infantry elements is really bad, and is probably the reason why, spoiler alert, the British suffer massive tank losses in the battle to come. The best way to explain this to you is to show you. So imagine a bunch of German infantry in the desert. They have anti-tank rifles and grenades, but really little to no anti-tank capability, right? So here comes a bunch of British Crusader tanks. Now, you'd imagine the British tanks would just overwhelm the German infantry, but is this really the case? They don't know where all the German infantry are because it's hard to see them in a steel box, so they didn't spot the German infantry hiding behind cover, and they've now got close to grenade, bomb and mine the British tanks. But you've also got to remember that the German infantry are armed with anti-tank guns as well. And we're not even talking about the 88mm flak guns here, we're talking about the 50mm Pak 38s and similar, which could penetrate every British tank from the front except for the Matildas. So it is a mistake to think that infantry could not take out tanks. Similarly, it is a mistake to think that tanks can take out infantry on their own. No, they can't. What you need is artillery and infantry to suppress the enemy anti-tank guns, and then artillery and infantry to keep the enemy infantry in check and prevent them from getting close to your tanks. Your tanks are then useful again and can take out enemy infantry and artillery positions. Coupled with air or even naval strikes, plus other arms, this is combined arms warfare. Therefore, the Hobart influence on Crusader, the splitting of the infantry from the tanks, as we will see, fundamentally weakens the British 8th Army before it's even got into battle. British tank doctrine between the wars was out of date, and the Germans had the advantage. We're going to talk about the British tanks and anti-tank guns and discuss whether the British had good tanks or not, and whether they were outgunned or not, but the point is that regardless of all of that, the British force structure was fundamentally flawed, and they didn't understand the role of anti-tank guns or infantry versus tank or combined arms as a whole, and this is mostly a result of the poor officers that they had. At the time, the men didn't realise their force structure or their guns weren't up to scratch, and the army itself was optimistic about the coming battle. The tank commanders and their men had no doubt that once they found Rommel's panzers, they would destroy them. So morale was high, even though they were referring to the enemy as Rommel rather than the Germans or the Axis, as this message from Auchinleck to the troops highlights. There exists a real danger that our friend Rommel is becoming a kind of magician or bogeyman to our troops, who are talking far too much about him. He is by no means a Superman, although he is undoubtedly very energetic and able. Even if he were a Superman, it would still be highly undesirable that our men should credit him with supernatural powers. I wish you to dispel by all possible means the idea that Rommel represents something more than an ordinary German general. The important thing now is to see to it that we do not always talk of Rommel when we mean the enemy in Libya. We must refer to the Germans or the Axis powers or the enemy and not always keep harping on Rommel. Please ensure that this order is put into immediate effect and impress upon all commanders that, from a psychological point of view, it is a matter of the highest importance. However, as Nielands points out, the effects of this order are not recorded, but it is unlikely that the troops paid any attention to it. Rommel was the best general in North Africa and everybody knew it. The only way to knock him off his pedestal was to defeat him in battle, and everyone knew that as well. Even still, morale was high, and this was despite the fact that Cunningham was commanding an army which was in transition. It was moving from the old professional regular soldiers to a new national service conscript army. The men were keen, brave and willing to serve, even if they still had to learn their new trade. It was apparent that the training before battle axe had been insufficient, and both Auchinleck and Cunningham were determined not to repeat the same mistakes as before. It was also known that the training the troops had received in Britain before getting to North Africa was based on the experience of the previous war. They were rapidly brought up to date. The British were fighting a different war than that of their fathers, or even themselves, who had fought in the First World War. They were also almost fighting a different war compared to the Axis, who were mostly non-motorised. 8th Army is almost fully motorised, and as we're about to see, was a much more diverse and different army to that of the Germans and Italians. British troops came from all over the world: Indians, New Zealanders, Australians, Poles, Czechs, South Africans, Scots, Welsh, English, Maoris. This really was a crusade of different nationalities fighting against their enemy. It's just a shame that their doctrine was so out of date, undermining their entire effort. So, let's take a look at the British units and commanders. Cunningham's 8th Army was split in two. We have Norrie's 30th Corps with the majority of the tank units on the one hand, and Godwin-Austen's 13th Corps with the majority of the infantry on the other. Let's take a look at the units within each, starting with 30 Corps. Note that it didn't have the rampant boar insignia yet, but I've decided to use it anyway to distinguish it from the other units. It's also worth noting that the officers of 30 Corps were largely from the remains of 2nd Armoured Division, the unit that was destroyed during Rommel's first desert offensive. We have 2 divisions and 2 brigades, and it's Gott's 7th Armoured Division that will be the centre of the show at the beginning of the battle. Colonel William Gott went by the nickname Strafer. Yes, Colonel. And he had only been promoted to Colonel on the 21st of October 1941, having been a Lieutenant Colonel up until this point, an acting Brigadier. So now he was made a full Colonel, but was acting Major General. So he was 2 ranks lower than what he probably should have been. Prior to Crusader, Strafer Gott had commanded 7th Armoured Division's support group, which we'll get to, and was an experienced artilleryman. He was used to taking on German tanks with artillery, so you'd think he'd put 2 and 2 together and have some idea of how to tackle German tanks in the most effective way with artillery. But no, this is probably the one guy who should have realised that tanks are not to be used to take on tanks alone, and yet he didn't. And while he wasn't necessarily a bad commander, he wasn't necessarily a good one either. He's just kind of there, and his performance is mediocre at best. Gott gets promoted over and over after failing again and again, without ever really grasping the tactical aspects needed to win this war. And he was now the guy in charge of 7th Armoured Division, going into Operation Crusader, the central unit in what was planned to be a tank battle. Basically, this is just not going to be good for the British. 7th Armoured Division has 3 brigades and 3 regiments under its command. It's worth noting that 2 of the 3 brigades are armoured brigades, and just 1 is a mixed infantry and artillery brigade. Again, the balance is off and there's simply not enough infantry here. Brigadier Davies' 7th Armoured Brigade consists of 3 tank battalions, which the British call tank regiments. Why? Well, to explain it simply, the Royal Tank Regiment is actually the mother unit. It stays in Britain to train battalions, which it then sends off to other places to fight. The battalions are then formed into brigades at the site of battle. But the way the British name their units can cause confusion. They don't call the battalions battalions. For example, they say 2nd Royal Tank Regiment, when this is actually a battalion. What it should be is 2nd Battalion of the Royal Tank Regiment, but they just call it 2nd Royal Tank Regiment. So this will get confusing in the battle because I'll be saying things like the 132nd Armoured Regiment goes up against the 2nd Royal Tank Regiment. The problem being that the British regiment is actually a battalion and thus is outnumbered 3-1. So, after consulting my patrons, who are awesome, in order to keep things easy to understand, I'm changing the names. Instead of 2nd Royal Tank Regiment, which is what this unit is called, I'm going to call it 2nd Battalion of the Royal Tank Regiment, because that's what it actually is. And I'll be doing the same with many British units throughout this video, such as the Field Artillery Regiments, which I'll simply be referring to as battalions. It's long-winded and it's annoying, but it's one of those things. But one thing to take away is that if you do read up on World War II and hear about British tank regiments fighting against enemy units, it's easy to think that the Germans were significantly outnumbered because of how many regiments there are, but in reality, the British regiments are battalions. Anyway, Davies' 7th Armoured Brigade is equipped with 141 tanks of various types, but all were British cruiser tanks, mostly A-15 Crusaders. The 2nd Brigade of 7th Armoured Division was Brigadier Scott Coburn's 22nd Armoured Brigade. This brigade was actually from 1st Armoured Division, Norrie's former division, which hadn't fully arrived from the British Isles when Operation Crusader got underway. This unit also had 3 battalions and was armed with 155 Crusader tanks. The 3rd Brigade in 7th Armoured Division was Brigadier Jock Campbell's 7th Support Group. This was the unit Gott had come from, and it was basically a mixed infantry and artillery force. Jock Campbell was actually a very interesting figure who had led a flying column, a battle group-like unit, against the Germans. After his superb leadership of this flying column, they were then nicknamed Jock Columns, and the name stuck. Jock columns were small, independent mixed infantry and artillery units which were effective if used correctly in raiding, scouting or harassing missions. But on the flip side, they tended to disperse and dilute British strength during the battles, so there is an argument on whether they were good or not. Either way, Campbell played a crucial and inspirational role during Operation Crusader, which earned him the Victoria Cross, unusual for someone of his rank. He became a legendary figure in the Desert War who survived the battle, but not the war. Overall then, 7th Armoured Division was a tank-heavy force with only a small amount of infantry in its support group. It was unbalanced, and this factor would undermine its performance during Crusader. The next division in 30 Corps was Major General George Brink's 1st South African Division. This was the main infantry element of the Corps, but only consisted of 2 brigades. Brink had led his division in East Africa under Cunningham and had fought in German East Africa in the First World War. Again, an infantry commander, not a tank man. Of the 2 brigade commanders, Brigadier Pienaar is the one we need to pay close attention to. Pienaar is a controversial figure who would lead his brigade in a very unique way during Operation Crusader, and yet, somehow, despite his very unusual performance, he would later go on to command 1st South African Division. When we get into the thick of the fighting, we'll be seeing exactly what Pienaar and his brigade were up to, but I'll say no more for now. There were also 2 independent brigades in 30 Corps, and both play an important part in the battle. The first is Brigadier Alexander Gatehouse's 4th Armoured Brigade Group. The reason it gets the name Group is because it was 4th Armoured Brigade plus some extra units on top of it. This brigade has 165 of the newly arrived US M3 light tanks, which I will not be referring to as Honeys or Stuarts because it's likely that they were never actually called that at the time. Alexander, or Alec, Gatehouse was a tank officer and was probably the most experienced tank officer the British had in the desert. So why they chose Gott over this guy, I don't know. For a brief history, Gatehouse had commanded a battalion of tanks in World War I and had been an instructor at Sandhurst and was Commandant of the Mechanisation Experimental Establishment at Farnborough between the years 1933 and 1937. He had a reputation of being a tank specialist, although wasn't a theorist, but he knew how to command tanks and understood tank warfare was different to cavalry warfare, unlike many of the British generals. According to the historian Barnett, Gatehouse was the only brigade commander to lead his brigade in the German style. He used anti-tank guns with the British tanks. It could be true, but I've got no further evidence to back that up, so take it with a pinch of salt. The 2nd Independent Brigade of 30 Corps is Brigadier Marriott's 22nd Guards Infantry Brigade. But before you say anything, this infantry brigade was ordered to protect the supply dumps of 30 Corps, and thus doesn't really get involved in the Crusader battle until the final stages of the Axis retreat. So this leaves Norrie with a very tank-heavy force, and he doesn't really have a lot of infantry support. This leads to problems for what is the main attacking corps during Crusader. Then we come to Lieutenant General Godwin-Austen's 13th Corps. This has 2 divisions and a brigade at the time, the 1st division being Major General Freyberg's 2nd New Zealand Division. Freyberg later became the 7th Governor-General of New Zealand and the first New Zealander to be appointed the position, which is why I'm playing the national anthem. This is the same Freyberg who was in command of Crete during the battle, ignoring ultra-intelligence saying he should expect an airborne assault and instead prepared for a naval landing. Freyberg has 3 brigades under his command, each with 3 infantry battalions. There's also a bunch of other units within the division, including Dittmer's 28th Maori Battalion, which I've given the Maori flag even though it wasn't invented until 1990. Why? Because it's a cool flag, and distinguishes the unit. The 2nd Division of 13th Corps was General Messervy's 4th Indian Division. Messervy was a cavalryman in the Middle East during the First World War and had fought with Cunningham and Godwin-Austen in East Africa in 1941. He had a rapid rise through the ranks, perhaps too rapid, and this factor would come to haunt him after Crusader. This was the same Messervy who would later go on to command the 7th Indian Division in the Burma campaign, playing a central role there. Messervy's 4th Indian Division has 3 brigades, again with 3 battalions each, plus some extra units as well. And yes, part of Freyberg's force, 2nd Battalion of the New Zealand Cavalry Regiment with tanks, was given to Messervy's division for Crusader. It's worth noting that 4th Indian Division had fought during Operation Compass, and they would be using the same tactics they used back then for Operation Crusader. The other unit of 13th Corps was Brigadier Watkins' 1st Army Tank Brigade, with 3 tank battalions. This unit was equipped with 132 infantry tanks, which were slower and thicker armoured tanks compared to the cruisers. Roughly half of these tanks were Matilda IIs, with the other half being the newer Valentine tanks. We'll come back to these tanks later. So yes, this is 13th Corps as a whole. There were several other units that took part in Crusader. The first was Major General Scobie's British 70th Infantry Division. This was actually the Tobruk Garrison, and had replaced most of Mooreshead's 9th Australian Division, although some of that unit hadn't been evacuated yet. Scobie's division consisted of 4 infantry brigades and 1 tank brigade. Technically, Kopansky's Polish brigade wasn't part of Scobie's division, but Scobie was in charge of the entire Tobruk garrison, so it was under his command. Kopansky's brigade actually had 5 infantry battalions, one of which was the 11th Czech Infantry Battalion. And Brigadier Willison's 32nd Tank Brigade had 32 cruisers, 25 M3 lights, and 69 Matildas at the start of the battle. Also as part of 8th Army was Brigadier Reid's Oasis force, which was a diversionary force designed to strike into the desert flank through Jalo towards the coast. He was under command of Brigadier Reid, who was in charge of 29th Indian Infantry Brigade Group. 8th Army also had Villiers' 2nd South African Division in reserve, and there were other smaller units like the Long Range Desert Group, 2 New Zealand Railway Construction Companies, and the 4th South African Armoured Car Battalion. And reinforcements would also pour in during the battle, including elements of Lumsden's 1st Armoured Division. This then was the British order of battle for Operation Crusader. There are several factors as to why the British didn't perform as well as the Germans on the tactical level. One of those factors was that they were undergunned. However, the guns they did have could take out the German tanks, so a little bit of a contradiction there, and this is up for debate. The argument has been made by several historians that the bad British doctrine that separated the anti-tank guns and infantry from the tanks was more important than the fact that the tanks were undergunned. But again, this is up for debate, so you be the judge. Crusader would see the largest concentration of armoured vehicles used in the Western Desert so far, and both sides knew that if they could take out the enemy's armour, they would win the battle. Therefore, this battle is very much about tanks and anti-tank warfare, which also includes the infantry and artillery. Some of you who know what happened during Crusader might be disagreeing with me on this statement, but remember, what happened later in Crusader could only happen once the armoured fight had been fought first. What happens to the tanks directly impacts the battle, so let's look at the equipment the British have, starting with probably the most important element, their guns. The main British anti-tank weapon in the early war period and during Operation Crusader was the 2-pounder 40mm anti-tank gun. This was the same 2-pounder anti-tank gun that was fitted on British tanks and on some armoured vehicles. Having lost 502 2-pounder anti-tank guns in France in 1940, the decision was made to keep producing the 2-pounder, even though the larger 6-pounder 57mm had already been designed. They did this because they desperately needed anti-tank guns, and they could produce more 2-pounders than 6-pounders. This decision has often been criticised and is a debate for another day, but either way the British were armed with a 2-pounder in 1941. For its calibre, size, it's actually a good gun. The problem is, its calibre was just too small. It was practically useless when fighting at 1,000 yards in range. At 1,000 yards, or 914 metres, according to the charts, which aren't always accurate, it could penetrate 41mm of armour, and 57mm of armour at 500 yards or 457 metres. If these charts are accurate, unless it was at 500 yards, 457 metres, or less, it couldn't penetrate the frontal armour of the Panzer IIIs and IVs, the main German battle tanks at the time. This meant that the gun crews had to get very close to the enemy in order to deal much damage at all, which exposed themselves to danger, especially when you consider that the 2-pounder gun carriage itself was actually quite a large thing and wasn't easy to hide. And British tanks also had to get close to the German tanks in order to have a chance of penetrating the armour. We'll come back to the German anti-tank guns later, but basically the Germans didn't have this problem. They could engage the British 2-pounder armed tanks at a distance with their own anti-tank guns without too much trouble. So this dictates British tactics. They have to get close to the enemy, which means they have to charge forwards to get embroiled in a melee with the enemy tanks, which at best doesn't really favour either side. But because the Germans did use their anti-tank guns with their tanks, even if the British got into this melee, they were at a disadvantage. And again, this is why the separation of tank from anti-tank guns and infantry and artillery is so bad for the British. Now, the British do have guns in 1941 that can take out the German tanks from the front, and at a distance of 1,000 yards or 914 metres. But these are their artillery guns, the 25-pounder field artillery howitzer. Now, this is a good gun. It was in service with the British from 1939 until the 1970s, and with some other nations apparently still using it today, 2018. According to the charts, this could penetrate the German tanks at 1,000 yards or less, and when used to take out the German tanks, it was quite effective. However, its intended role was as an artillery piece, therefore it wasn't usually accompanying the tanks or infantry battalions, and if it was in support of them, it was firing from a distance as artillery, not in the direct fire role needed to be an anti-tank piece. And even if it was with the tanks, as it was on occasion, the same issues they came up against in Operation Battleaxe happened again. The 25-pounders outranged both the British tanks and the German Panzer IIIs, so it could take out the Panzer IIIs from a distance. But the British artillery wasn't self-propelled and had to unlimber from the trucks, set up and then fire. This took a few minutes to accomplish, and while the Panzer IIIs may not have had the range with its 50mm gun, the Panzer IVs did almost have the range with their short-barreled 75mm guns. While the Panzer IVs might not be able to harm the British tanks, they could fire on the 25-pounders with their high-explosive rounds. They wouldn't even need to score a direct hit in order to persuade the British gun crews to pack up and leave. This meant that the 25-pounders only had a couple of minutes to fire their shots before the Panzer IVs came into range and forced them to retire. This then exposed the British tanks to both Panzer and German anti-tank gunfire. And then you have the 88mm flak guns, which will chew through everything at silly ranges, although these were available in limited numbers and didn't always accompany the Panzers. So even in the best scenario the British could be in, the Germans had the advantage, but the argument could be made that if the British infantry and artillery had accompanied the tanks more often, this advantage wouldn't have been so severe, and it may have been enough to allow British weight in numbers to overwhelm the Germans. At the very least, it would have turned the tank fight into an attritional fight, which would ultimately favour the British, and they probably wouldn't have lost as many tanks as they did do in this scenario. As it was, 7th Armoured Division, the main division in the early part of Crusader, the 25-pounder field artillery and the motorised infantry were located in Jock Campbell's 7th Support Group. This unit often operated separately to the British tanks as an independent unit, and thus didn't support the tanks all the time. This was also a brigade-sized unit, with a mix of infantry and artillery, so even if it had supported the British tanks, 3 tank brigades could not be supported effectively with just one mixed infantry and artillery brigade. And this is why the British were at a disadvantage going into Crusader. British tank doctrine at this point split the tanks into 2 categories. You have the World War I idea of tanks that support infantry, which the British called infantry or I tanks, and you have the exploitation tanks, which the British called cruiser tanks. This doctrine makes sense for a nation thinking it was going to refight the disaster that was the First World War, but in reality it wasn't really an effective tank doctrine. In 1941, the British have 2 infantry tanks. The first is the old Matilda Mark II. This was a slow but very heavily armoured tank. O'Connor had used the Matilda very effectively during Operation Compass in 1940, and the Italians at the time really didn't have anything that could take this out. It was actually more heavily armoured than any tank the Germans had at the time. But there were a couple of issues with the Matilda. The main issue was its speed. It was just far too slow and could be taken out by the German 88s from a massive distance before they had any chance of firing back. This then brings us to the second issue, the 2-pounder gun. The Germans could knock this tank out way before it could get into range to fire back. Plus, this was an infantry tank. Why then it was an issue with high explosive ammunition is beyond me. It was a tank going up against enemy infantry and anti-tank guns, as it was designed to do, but it could only use its machine gun in this role because the shells for the 2-pounder were armour piercing only. So while this tank was fine against the Italians in 1940, it was very much out of date against the Germans in 1941. It was useful against the Japanese who struggled to tackle the armour, so it was used effectively in the Pacific. However, it was obvious to the British that they needed to replace this tank in the desert. This brings us to the Valentine, which was originally designed as a cruiser tank. This wasn't as heavily armoured as the Matilda, but was faster. It had 60mm of armour at the front, which meant that unless the Germans had 88mm to hand, their 50mm Pak 38s would have to get within 500 yards, 457 metres, in order to take these things out. But they could take these things out at closer ranges, which is where the Valentines would be if they were in the infantry support role, assaulting enemy positions. Vyvyan Pope, the experienced tank officer, repeatedly reported before he was killed that they would only accept the Valentine tanks as a stopgap measure. Vision from the tank was poor, and the tracks and drive wheels were exposed, making them vulnerable to being disabled. And it was clear to Pope that they weren't fast enough to be a cruiser tank, so they couldn't keep up with the Crusaders and so on, and they weren't heavily armoured enough to be protected in the assault role. Basically, they weren't suited to going up against German tanks, they weren't suited to being an exploitation tank, and they weren't suited to being an infantry support tank. They were kind of an in-between cruiser and infantry tank, but were bad at both roles, so Pope basically painted them as rubbish, but said they'd have them while they designed something else. Clearly not a good review for the Valentine. So the British withdrew the Matilda tanks from 7th Armoured Division and lumped both the Matildas and the Valentines into the 2 tank brigades and then used them to support the infantry in their assaults on the frontier positions. It's not ideal, and both tanks certainly had their problems taking on the German positions there, but it's the best they could manage in the circumstances. 7th Armoured Division then received the faster cruiser tanks, the latest of which was the Crusader. This was fast and manoeuvrable, but light to break down all the time. It had 40mm of frontal armour, which meant that the main German anti-tank guns, the Pak-38s, could penetrate it at 1000 yards, 914 metres or less, and the Panzer III could tackle it at 500 yards, 457 metres or less. The British therefore had to get close to the German tanks in order to do any damage, whereas the German tanks could sit back and let their anti-tank guns fire at the British. Coupled with the awful breakdown rate, this was why Auchinleck asked the Prime Minister for a 50% reserve in tank numbers. They thought they were going to lose that many of them, either as breakdowns or knocked out. The British still had many older cruiser tanks, such as the cruiser A-13. These were quite similar to the Crusaders in that they had a 2-pounder gun, were lightly armoured, were fast, but also mechanically unreliable. So the British lumped many of their Crusader tanks into the new and inexperienced 22nd Armoured Brigade, and 7th Armoured Brigade got a mix of the Crusader and older cruiser tanks. And you might be asking yourself, why? Who knows? Maybe because they were used to them? Probably. Surely it makes more sense to have your best troops armed with the best kit, but that wasn't the case during Crusader. Now, Britain in 1941 is seriously struggling to meet its war production demands. US policy at the time was to wait for her to be on the verge of bankruptcy before Lend-Lease would begin, which is why shipments only started in late 1941. So, Britain needed tanks. Any tanks, which is why the first M3 light tanks they received were pressed into service on the front line. These things were light reconnaissance tanks. They were armed with a 37mm gun, which performance-wise was similar to the British 2-pounders. They were also reliable and faster than any other tank in Africa, but they had a limited range, required frequent refuelling, their fighting compartment was small and awkward, and their armour was slightly thinner than the British tanks. Again, the M3 Lights were designed to be reconnaissance tanks, but such was the shortage of material that the British had to use them as a cruiser tank. The men liked the speed and mechanical reliability of the M3s, but it's obvious to us now that these things were certainly no better than the British cruiser tanks, and were going up against the medium panzer tanks which they would struggle to deal with. On top of this, the ammunition for this gun was scarce, and modifications had to be made to the tank to make it capable of fighting in the desert. The British troops certainly hadn't seen this tank before, and had to be retrained to use it. This is part of the reason why Auchinleck was pressing for a delay before starting the operation. And because the cruisers and M3s were different tanks which operated at different speeds and so on, it was decided to put all the M3 Lights into Gatehouse's 4th Armoured Brigade. Overall then, the British were going into this battle with tanks which had serious flaws, most notably their guns. But apart from the new M3 Lights, the British cruiser tanks were also unreliable, which was bad news for the British. The recovery and repair system for armour was hopelessly inadequate, and unlike the Germans who could repair a tank and get it back into action in days, Auchinleck's best hope was 3 months or more. It was on this basis that he determined to hold about 50% extra tanks in reserve. One last thing we need to consider as well. The British had massive radio issues, mainly thanks to their pre-war economic cutbacks. For starters, they didn't have enough sets, and the sets that they did have didn't work properly in the desert, or at Bruneval, or Arnhem, or probably anywhere else, you get the picture. In the desert, the medium sets didn't work at all, and none of them had the range needed on the vast battlefields they were about to engage in. On top of this, there was a shortage of cipher staff, which further delayed communications. The British tried to get around this by using veiled conversations, but the Germans quickly figured out what the British were talking about, so this just gave the Germans all their intelligence. Interruptions in the communication systems were the norm. This meant that orders from above and communications from below didn't flow. The result was that units became isolated and, at times, 8th Army HQ could not communicate with one or both of its core HQs. Information didn't get through, and this left the higher command out of touch with the reality on the ground. As we will see, this had massive repercussions on the outcome of Operation Crusader and Cunningham's performance during the battle. In terms of infantry numbers for Operation Crusader, none of the sources make it clear exactly how many men both sides had. The closest source I have is the official British history, which provides percentages of the losses incurred at the end of the battle. So, doing some quick maths, from these percentages, the British have around 118,000 men, the Germans have around 65,000 men, and the Italians around 55,000. So it's 118,000 British versus 120,000 Axis troops, more or less. 30 Corps has a total of about 477 tanks. These were 32 early cruisers, 62 A-13 cruisers, 210 Crusaders, and 173 M3 light tanks. With the extra brigades in 13th Corps and in Tobruk, they also had an additional 261 tanks. Of these, there were 132 infantry tanks, roughly half being Matildas and half Valentines. This was a total of 736 British tanks. There were 550 Axis tanks in total, which we'll come back to, meaning the British had about 180 more tanks than the Axis. Really, 7th Armoured Division should have only had the 7th and 4th Armoured Brigades as its subordinate armoured brigades, but it had 22nd Armoured Brigade as well. This meant that 7th Armoured Division actually had 9 tank battalions for Operation Crusader. These 9 battalions would go up against 4 German tank battalions and 3 Italian, for a total of 7 Axis tank battalions. So the British had a tank ratio of 4-3 over their opponents, and a 2-1 advantage over the Germans alone. They would also have in the region of 34,000 lorries, 600 field guns, 80 heavy and 160 light anti-aircraft guns, 200 anti-tank guns and 900 mortars. However, as the official British history points out, these equipment deliveries were barely enough to replace the losses they'd taken prior to Crusader, and therefore didn't allow much of a reserve. So while they had the material advantage, it wasn't really decisive. The RAF had 650 aircraft, 550 of which were serviceable. These were under Air Vice Marshal Arthur Cunningham's Western Desert Air Force. Yes, Cunningham is the land guy and Cunningham is the air guy. Thanks for that history, that's not going to be confusing. Cunningham's force had 16 squadrons of fighters, bombers and tactical reconnaissance aircraft. For support, Malta could also deploy 66 serviceable aircraft of its 74 total. All these would go up against the Luftwaffe's 342 serviceable aircraft out of 536, giving the British numerical superiority over the Germans at the beginning of the battle. Unfortunately, I don't have the Italian aircraft numbers. Therefore, I think we can conclude that while the British have more tanks than the Axis, in practically every other equipment area and in their doctrines, they are actually at a disadvantage. Auchinleck was aware that the British tanks and guns were not capable and wasn't happy overall, which is why he was trying to delay and eke out as much of an advantage as possible. In terms of commanders, the British generals were all new or had been rapidly raised up the ranks. None of them had any armoured warfare experience, Few had had desert warfare experience, their doctrines were out of date, the organisational structure of their divisions put them at a disadvantage, and their guns and their tanks were not equal to the task ahead. In contrast, facing 8th Army across the border in Libya was an Axis force led by one of the greatest proponents of armoured warfare of the time, with subordinate commanders who had not only fought in a number of tank battles, but were also acclimatised to fighting in the desert. And all of this is before we've even considered the plan. Next Monday we will look at the plan for Crusader and find out why the United States of America, which hadn't even joined the war yet, were feeding the Axis with British intelligence. Yes, you heard me correctly. Thanks for watching, bye for now.